Welcome back to the Anchored Podcast, the official podcast of the Classic Learning Test. My name is Soren Schwab, VP of Partnerships here at CLT, and today we're joined by Krista Autrey. Krista currently serves as the Director of the Center for Calling and Career at Geneva College in Pennsylvania. In her role, she works with students and alumni to discover how they can meaningfully contribute to the world around them through combining their individual strengths and experiences within their current life context. Krista earned her bachelor's degree from Auburn University and a master's degree from Wheaton College, and we're so delighted to have her on the Anchored podcast today. Welcome, Krista.
Oh, thanks, Soren. I'm excited to get to spend some time with you.
Yeah, likewise. As our listeners of Anchored know, we always start the podcast by talking about our guests' own educational journey, their own background. So talk to us a little bit about that. What kind of schools did you attend, K-12 and beyond?
Yeah, so I grew up in a really small town. And so I went to a really small public school, a pretty rural, honestly, public school. So it was size-wise probably the size of a private school for a lot of people, but it was public. And I mentioned I went to Auburn. I was a third-generation Auburn student. And so I grew up in a Christian home, grew up going to church, and that was really important. But going to faith-based schools was just not a part of the conversation at all. It was always, hey, we'll go to Auburn. Like, that's what our family does. So that's where I went. I considered a small Christian school for about a week, and my family was like, wait, what? What are you thinking? So I went to Auburn. I loved it. I was part of an amazing campus ministry there that really developed my faith. But from there, I decided to go to Wheaton College, which was my first experience with faith-based private education, which was just revolutionary. It was a very different way of doing education than anything I'd experienced, particularly in regards to like life on life with faculty members, and even the shared life purpose and values with the people I was learning alongside. So I loved all of it. It was all really good, but very different along the way too.
Yeah. How big is Auburn? Do you have a sense, just student-wise? I mean, is it like 30,000 or more?
Yeah, it's around, I think, 30,000 now. When I went, it was probably like 23 to 25.
Yeah.
So still big, but
Right.
not as big as some, for sure.
Right. And now comparing it with, Wheaton, you're at Geneva now, you were at Grove City. They're all kind of in the 2,000 probably range.
Yeah, roughly somewhere between probably 1 and 3 or 4,000 or something like that. And I think every time you add 1,000, it does shift. It shifts the experience a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. And so, did you choose Wheaton mainly because it was a Christian kind of, you wanted to go into Christian higher ed?
Yeah. So whenever I was at Auburn, like I mentioned, I was a part of a really like a wonderful, a pretty established campus ministry that was a part of the church that I attended while I was there. And I interned with the youth ministry of that church, and then eventually interned as a campus ministry intern there, and loved doing ministry. And I learned that probably in my sophomore year of college, but there isn't like a ministry degree at most state schools, usually like religious studies, which is a little different. So I knew I'd probably go on and get my master's somewhere. I knew that it would either be ministry or missions based. And someone I knew mentioned Wheaton. And honestly, I didn't grow up in the context of faith-based school, so I didn't know a lot about Wheaton. But I looked up their programs and I thought, wow, this sounds like exactly, maybe what I want to do. And I went up to visit, met professors, and just fell in love with it. So I wasn't necessarily looking for a school. I guess I was looking for a school where I could grow in this desire to pursue ministry and missions in some way.
So I assume that it was not just the adjustment of, big campus to small, but also growing up in the South to spending winters in Illinois and now Pennsylvania.
You know what? The winter is, school-wise, I think I figured that out. But the winter is really, it's hard to prepare yourself for. I'm from Florida. So, winter is just, it was foreign. And I think my second winter there, my first winter, everyone said in Chicago, like, oh, this is really mild. And I thought, who? Like, what are you talking about? And then my second winter was their third harshest winter in history. So I feel like I got a really good both sides of that spectrum, and it prepared me well for Pennsylvania, which is never as bad.
Right, yeah, yeah. I went to school in Michigan, and was it miserable at times? Yes, it was.
Oh
But I
yeah,
always said, the harsh winters were definitely conducive to a high GPA. So I feel like at
there
those
you go.
times, I just
You're
will go to the
forced
library and
inside.
study. Yeah, exactly, exactly. So,
Uh,
obviously, you now, I mentioned the bio, you serve kind of as director of calling and
yeah.
careers. Um, and so, with that added perspective, I'd love for you to kind of go back to how you chose your career, your calling. I think it'd be interesting for our listeners to kind of see that perspective. And are there maybe things that, now with the
Mm.
title that you have and the work that you're doing, where you look back and say, yeah, I didn't do any of that. But I still, ended up obviously following God's calling.
Yeah, and I think because of the situation I was in, where I came into college thinking, really, I don't know that I would have said it this way, but looking back, I was interested in prestige and money. Like, I want to find, something that's impressive,
Yeah.
something that's challenging, and something that will be a really good career. And then I got to college, and I I became involved in that campus ministry eventually, and my faith just, it just started sinking deeper and deeper and deeper.
Mm,
And I'd always had this developmental bent. I was in sports growing up. I loved mentoring younger teammates. That was always something that was really important to me. So that development piece was always there. But whenever my faith started to deepen, I started to realize, no, like, this is the way I think I've been made. Like, I've been made with this bent towards helping people develop themselves and growing alongside of them. And then I entered with youth ministry, and I loved that type of environment, and helping people really start to make faith their own. And then I loved doing that with college students too. And then eventually I started leading like short-term mission trips with those college students, and I fell in love with what happens when we get to interact with the global
mhm.
church, and believers from other parts of the world, and how different their faith can look from ours, and how formational that was, um, for myself and other students. And so I love the college age. I love that international element. So I all during college I thought I wish I could like blend these two somehow. I wish I could do like campus ministry internationally. I don't know that that really exists. But the one thing that in prayer and kind of just relationship with the Lord, I thought, okay, like, He's given me these two loves. And so I'll just keep pursuing both until He makes me choose.
Yeah.
And I did that. And so that led me to, I was overseas for about 6 months working with refugees in Austria, actually in Vienna, Austria. So I was like, I need to try that out. So I went and tried that out, and that was hard, like very, very hard, and a beautiful place, and really, really wonderful world city. But it was challenging, and it was a bit of a wake up call. And so then I went to Wheaton, and I studied intercultural studies and TESOL, so teaching English to speakers of other languages, which was trying to get at that international student type mindset. I was trying to marry my two loves. Like, I was trying to force it, and studied that the whole time. I took like half of Wheaton's program in Christian formation and ministry while I was there, which was not a part of my program at all, but it was the student piece. And when I finished Wheaton, I still wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I still was thinking maybe I should get another master's. I don't know. I feel like this isn't it. And this perfect position opened up at a really young organization back down in the South in Georgia. And it was leading college students internationally and developing international partnerships. And it was like the job description was made for me. And so what I learned from that was the only option I had that whole time was to be faithful with what the Lord had given me. And I didn't even know if I would ever be able to do it. I thought I would just be forced to choose. And He was preparing me that whole time for something that I could have guessed. And so that idea of faithfulness and just being faithful to what the Lord has given you, even if you don't have the full picture, it is woven so much in the work that I get to do with students here.
Yeah. I have to ask, you were in Austria. Sprechen Sie ein bisschen Deutsch noch, oder?
Uh, A little, yeah. I'm trying to learn it again right now.
Yeah,
I learned some of it. I picked up pieces of it, but I'm actually for the past 2 or 3 years I've been trying to learn it more intentionally.
so hard to
Um,
retain, right?
it is, you know what? If I because I've worked in Brazil a lot, and so I would pick up Portuguese too. And what I learned was I think the best language learning is when you're learning it and when you're immersed.
Yeah.
Like that double, it's really hard to do it outside of that, but yes,
It sticks more when you're actually
yes.
forced to not
And
just learn it at home, but
you
then
have no
also for
choice.
survival reasons, right?
Yes,
You have to use it. Oh,
exactly.
how wonderful. Now, of course, so in your current role, you work with college students, but I know a lot of our listeners are, homeschool parents, teachers, school leaders, and some high school
Yeah.
students themselves. So when we talk about college and career,
Mhm.
I think right now there's certainly even a question about should does everyone have to go to college?
Mhm.
How do we is college still worth it? What about trade school? What about other opportunities besides
Mhm.
that? So, um, what advice would you give a high school student right now who might be thinking about this kind of decision in life? What is my career going to be like? Do I need college for it? Is this the right path for me? What would you tell them?
Yeah, I love talking to students about this. I was talking to a incoming student and her mother yesterday this with the same conversation, and I think the reason I love this conversation is because I think we have it culturally really poorly. And in a way that puts a lot of pressure on 16, 17, 18-year-olds to decide on something that theoretically will follow them their whole life. And I don't think life works that way. I think our lives are seasonal, they change, they shift. Some things are constant, but in many ways, they're not deciding what they're going to do with their whole life right now.
Mhm.
They're deciding what they're going to do next. And that's a very different perspective than saying, "Hey, I'm going to choose to study math, and then I guess I'll be a mathematician or a math teacher for the next 40 years and then retire." Life doesn't typically work that way anymore. I think it worked more that way historically, but people shift what they do. Career fields change. I mean, some of them are changing fast,
Yeah.
and so taking that pressure off and saying, "Hey, we don't need you to decide forever. We just need you to decide for now." And I think even in regards to the college component, uh, I like I think it's really wonderful for students who choose to go onto college immediately. I worked at a gap year program for students between high school and college for
Hmm.
a while, and the growth I saw in just 1 year where students had space just to figure some things out. They were still in a very structured environment. They were still learning, but there was no pressure to decide. They just had the space to learn, to explore,
Hmm.
to learn about themselves, to learn about God and the world around them. The maturity that came from that year was so significant for students who then most of them went on to college after that, a 4 year college. But I I think there are different ways of doing it. And I think people really have to sit down and think about their own circumstances and where they are and what does it look like to
Hmm.
be faithful and to be intentional with a choice, regardless of where that puts you immediately after high school.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that itself could probably be a whole podcast episode. And the idea
Sure.
of college and career readiness and kind of the cookie cutter approach. But
Yeah.
if nothing else, obviously, COVID has uh, put a lot of these questions back to the forefront. Why are we doing this in
Mhm.
the first place? And I think asking the question, what's the point of college, is not necessarily a bad question, right?
Yeah.
Because if it's really only to get a better, higher paying job, then
Hmm.
you're probably going to go out of business because they're going to be in different
Yes.
ways, right? And I think Geneva, and the folks I know at Geneva,
Mhm.
you have a much different value proposition, and it's not, it's really about formation, right? Like
Yeah.
forming you as a human being that in this
Yes.
ever-changing world,
Hmm.
you'll be able, like you said, if things happen, right? I mean, we're shifting careers much faster. The one constant, I guess, is you're going to be a human for the rest of your life. And so,
Yeah.
how about how about developing you as a human? I mean, is that it seems, I guess, it seems maybe a little idealistic, but are
Yeah.
those conversations that families are receptive to when you talk to them about putting off some of that pressure of you have to know everything just yet?
You know, it's Yes and no. I think there's a tension there. There's always a
Hmm.
tension with this desire for your son or daughter to be able to support themselves even financially. I think
Hmm.
sometimes that's a big stressor is, I just don't want my kid to have to worry about finances forever. And I think that is so valid. I never, I'll say this, I always try and have this conversation with students or with students and parents, regardless of how that happens, with the reality of finances being a part of it. Because I think if we
Yeah.
pretend like finances don't matter, we're fooling ourselves because they do matter. The question is, how much emphasis do we put on it, and how much do we let that drive the decision? Um, Remind me of your original question really quick, because I forgot where I was going with that.
Well, just yeah, if the idea of college
Oh yeah,
only being for to get you a high paying job,
yeah,
right? Like
yes,
that I think we're starting to see a shift there. That
yeah,
it should college be about something
yeah,
more, and is that value proposition maybe even easier at Geneva
yes.
than it might be at Harvard and Yale?
Yeah. Okay. So the formation piece, I think that was, I remember now, that's where that's where I was heading. So what's interesting about parents to me is when I have this conversation with them, it's usually either at like a preview day where they're here with their, their prospective student, or summer orientation. A
Hmm.
lot of the time they're here. And so they're part of these conversations too. And what's always fascinating is when I have this conversation about, I paint this picture and I put up this image of the way we're taught to view life. And it's, hey, 0 to 5 years old is like the preschool years. And then you hit 5 to 18. And those are, the traditional school years. You know what's coming next every year. You don't really have a choice. You have to be in
Yeah.
some type of school, regardless of what that looks like. And then once you hit 18, you have some agency, some people more than others. But you're probably going to enter into some type of like transitional or training or college or something like that for probably 3 to 5 years, depending on what it is, maybe a little less, maybe a little more. And then you just work for like 40 or 50 years. And then hopefully you retire. And then, like that's it. And I always ask students, like, hey, who's really excited about this? And they're all, and I do this in classes sometimes too. And they're like, no, I'm not excited at all, but I do think that's the way it's supposed to be. And then I put up a different kind of almost like map to some degree. And I say, this is what I think life looks like. And it's broken down into shorter seasons. And it's a constantly reevaluating. What are my values? How do I want to live? Hey, now I have children. How does that shift the way I'm looking at the world? Hey, I thought I really cared about this, but actually it doesn't matter as much as I thought it did.
Mm.
And just this shift in how there's a book called Designing Your Life by two professors out of Stanford. And that one thing they talk about is that we actually live our whole lives in seasons of about 3 to 5 years. That pattern never ends. And so trying to give them something that is more what I think realistic. And the people who always respond the deepest to that are actually parents. And they say, yeah, that's it. You're right. Like this is the way life has worked. But getting that to sometimes connect back to, okay, so what does that mean for your student who's now having to decide? How does that inform the way they make their decision? That's that's sometimes a shift because we're always looking back saying, well, I wish I would have maybe done a few things differently.
Hmm.
So that's one part of the conversation. The second part of the conversation is the formation part, which I think Geneva does incredibly well. So we can still talk about that if you want to, and I
Yeah,
would love to at
absolutely.
some
I'd love
point.
to. Yeah, I would love to hear that approach. Yeah.
So one of my favorite stories of uh, one of our like alum who he's a former president of a large global corporation. I'll say that much. And he always says he worked at that corporation his whole career. And he says the first maybe like 5 or so years I was using my training as an engineer. And then after that, it was all the core classes that I used the rest of the time in
Wow.
actually leading. And so I think we think so right in front of us. And when we talk about career, hey, I need to learn professional skills for my first job, and that's true. That's not untrue. We do need to know those, and you have to be competitive, but you also have to understand when things are shifting and to be able to read the world around you and say, oh, now it's time to shift, or hey, I've been promoted, and now I have to use different skills now, and that's where I think the Geneva education, it is, I mean, one of the first papers a student writes when they come to Geneva, this always blows my mind. But they study like the whole life, and they study death, and they actually have to write a paper on death, which sounds really morbid.
Yeah.
But they just start thinking very differently at the beginning, saying, hey, okay, this isn't something I ever think about. I don't have to think about it very much. Some of them do, for different reasons, but most of them, they're not thinking about their whole life. They're thinking about what's in front of them. And so it's this call to say, hey, in terms of this idea of calling, like you might be an engineer, a certain type of engineer, or you might, be, an accountant, or you might be an environmental scientist for 5 years. You might be one for 40 years, but for sure, like you said, you'll be a human for your whole life. And so what does that mean to develop myself for my whole life and not just myself for a portion of my life? And so that, it is so a part of, all of Geneva's core classes, which are extensive, but they're getting that in their professional classes too. How do we think about this from a broader perspective? And it really does make a difference. And so students always come back like 5 years later and they say, oh, I get it now. I'm so thankful for that, because now I'm set up for a long time and not just for the immediate.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you, and I'm hoping I can piece it all together, because I have scrambled thoughts right now. I'm reminded, and I think they're, I think it's is it Arthur Brooks or David Brooks? Anyways, it talks about the eulogy virtues or values, right? And like, what do people remember you for? But I'm also thinking about our current culture, and we hear a lot about kind of your own, like, relativistic, right? Your own values, create your own values, whatever you find valuable, your lived experience, like all these things. And then I'm also thinking about, and I'm sure we've all done them, right? Whether in high school or in college, we filled out these surveys to find a career path, right? And so how do you navigate all of that, right? Where you probably have students that are, in a way, the world tells them one thing, right? And then, we or their faith, or maybe just common sense in a way tells them a different thing. How do you weave that together and still value their lived experience, right? In the context in which they live, but also have, like you said, that longer term perspective, right? Of this isn't everything, right? How do you have that conversation with students where you feel like maybe, I don't want to say you're wrong, right? Or what you're feeling is wrong, but also I do want to point you to maybe explore other things.
Yeah. Okay. Wait, I want to make sure I'm understanding that question correctly. Can you kind of give me an example of that really quick?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking, whether it's a 17-year-old or maybe a 21-year-old, right? So senior in high school, senior in college, and the world is telling them a lot of things about what their values should be, what they should, what their lived experience is, and how their feelings are, which they're undeniably true to them, right? But then you also look at the larger context of objective truth, of calling, of all these things that you as a career coach probably kind of see the longer term vision. How do you navigate that with students, where, in a way, I guess you want to acknowledge how they feel and what they think, but you also probably want to kind of show them, like, this isn't everything, right? There's a different way.
Yeah. So I think, with trying to think of the best way to address this, students have a really small snapshot of life. They don't know that yet. They have the 18, 19, 20 years and whatever perspective they grew up in, which sometimes was, a pretty maybe small context. And I think there's two parts to that, because one of it is helping them think beyond maybe what they've known to be true, and known to be true from like, hey, everyone in my family's a teacher, so I'll be a teacher, right? It's like, okay, well, like maybe, but maybe not. I think in regards to, the values and the lived experiences, It's funny that we're talking about this because as I think about it, this doesn't come up a whole lot with Geneva
Okay.
students. And I think
Okay.
it's partly because of what they're learning in their classroom.
Hmm.
Um, they there's just there's a grounding that's there that I wouldn't say I've encountered with students sometimes at other schools. So I think that's where I'm actually probably I'm a little taken off guard with this question because
Yeah.
I it doesn't that's just not an issue that I face with Geneva students a whole lot.
Seems
Um,
countercultural.
it's actually it's very countercultural. I would say it's the exception, not the rule, by far. So I probably don't have a great answer for you, to be honest, just because it doesn't come up a whole lot here.
Probably the best advertising you can have for Geneva, right? That's really not because
You know
I
what?
yeah.
Yes, I'll say this. I was sitting, sometimes I ask myself, we talk about calling and vocation a lot at Geneva. We're the Center for Calling and Career, which is not uncommon in Christian schools, but it's less common. And sometimes I wonder, is what we're doing really different, or is it just like a little shift on the norm career wise? And I had the chance to sit with some other career professionals from another faith based school recently. And I just felt like we were missing each other
Hmm.
constantly because the way we were talking about calling to them, I think felt really irrelevant to some degree because it was much more just career focused. Like, well, yeah, but they have to do these things. We're like, well, yeah, like they do, but like we're trying to give them something bigger than just career. And I was reflecting later. I was like, why was that conversation so tricky? Like, why couldn't we find a place in the ground to meet, especially being two faith based schools with a
Mhm.
lot of similarities, I would argue. But that conversation of, hey, you are bigger than what you do. Uh, but the Lord is bigger than all of that, right? And like that's our anchor. Um, that conversation is had from the very top to the very bottom at Geneva. It is fully woven through everything. And so it's not just like a slogan, it's not just something we say to people, it is in our DNA. And when you get here, you recognize that. So
Mm.
it's funny that that question is throwing me off because I'm like, that's just not something we talk about a lot.
Yeah,
It is, but not with students
th-
in that regard.
there's and I felt that way about my undergraduate institution. Like, oh, you're just in a bubble. Sometimes it's not bad being in a certain bubble.
Bubbles
If,
are
if
everywhere.
right, they're
Like
everywhere.
they're
It's just what
everywhere.
kind of
Yeah,
bubble are you having?
exactly. Yes.
And so
Yeah.
not not the worst bubble. I'm also wondering. I mean, and I understand why colleges, even Christian colleges, kind of have to, they have to publish their stats, right?
Yeah.
And
Sure.
of course, it's a point of pride if you have whatever percent job placement and all these
Yeah.
things, and it's so interesting because on the one hand, we're kind of criticizing, some of the elite institutions, right, the Ivy Leagues, but if we get someone at a Harvard Law School, like, oh, we
Yes.
gotta point that out, right? There's not a good statistic on 5 years, 10 years
Yeah.
down the road regardless of what the students are doing, they're happy, right? But how do you quantify? How do you measure that? But to your
Hmm.
point, I guess, is because they're so grounded, in
Hmm.
those students in 5 or 10 years, they might not be a teacher anymore. They might not be in their initial field, but are they happy? Have they found something that gives them purpose and fulfillment?
Yeah.
That study does not exist, I think, and I don't know how you would do it. But isn't that really what matters? They're happy husbands
Yeah.
and wives, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Good parents,
Yeah.
attentive, willing to see the people in front of them and get to know people at a deeper level than just the surface and, call people around them to something deeper than just, the superficial lives we often lead. I was talking with our VP of enrollment and marketing recently, and we were talking about how, Geneva's unique value proposition. And I was like, how do you help people understand that what's going to be helpful for them is something way bigger than they can understand at this point. And we can't promise it's immediate. And we love immediacy, right? We love things that are
Yeah.
like, you get it now, right? Because it is a seed that just keeps growing throughout life. I think like the Geneva education, which I think like I've been at several faith-based institutions, and I came to Geneva because that's what I found in the people that I
Mm.
met who had come from here. Like every time I met someone from Geneva, they were just these people with a deep faith, just substantive humans. And I thought, man, like I want to work with those people. Like I want to be a part of that. And it's just proven to be true. Like it's just continuously proven to be true. And it is hard sometimes to help people see that long-term vision, but man, it's a different way of living. And it's a good way of living, not always easy and not always happy,
No.
right? Like sometimes it's hard, but it's the meaning and the purpose and the understanding that the world is bigger than you and God is just infinitely bigger than you. And he's created this world with an infinite number of things to be discovered. And how cool
Mhm.
is that? How cool is that we get to be a part of that?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And we employ a lot of liberal arts majors, from institutions like Geneva and others, and they're just different.
Mm,
And we're a growing company. There's always change, and um, these students are able to weather that and to find
mm,
ways to, with grace, but also with diligence and hard work. And
sure.
it really is we like to say, if you want kind of the best marketing,
Mm,
for classical education or this liberal arts education, is just talk to students that have received it, that have gone to
um,
these colleges, because it's noticeably different. So we are
yeah,
so grateful. Shout out to Willem. He's one of my
yeah,
favorite humans. What you're doing at Geneva is really, I mean, it is transformative, right?
yeah,
That's what a good education, especially good Christian education, does.
yeah.
Krista, of course, I have one more question for you, and
Of
I'm really
course.
curious about your answer to that. It's
Oh,
always the last question we ask on the Anchored podcast. My
hmm.
favorite, although probably the most difficult to answer. But if there's one book or one text that you can point to, looking back, that you say, "Wow, this had probably had was most impactful in my life," what would it be
Yeah,
and why?
yeah, I saw this question and I thought, oh no, I love to read and I read a lot. And so I think always nailing down one book is just, there's
It's
always
not
a
fair.
current
We
book
agree. It's
now,
not
right?
fair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say the book I always come back to, and I would say if I'm looking at my whole life and say, hey, what book had the deepest influence for the longest time, um, in a specific season, the book that I always say is The Divine Conspiracy by Dallas Willard.
Hmm.
And I read it in college, or maybe like right after college, so a long time ago, and I've read pieces of it since then. I've not ever reread the full text, but it just shifted the way I thought about a lot of my faith. He has a whole section on heaven and hell in that book that was really helpful, and the way that he just framed it in a way I'd never heard before, in a gracious way, but a true way, if that makes sense. And I think when we have that conversation, we tend towards one or the other, and he walked that line really well, and he just called me to something deeper in what he was writing about. So I say that book a lot. And I love Dallas Willard. He has a if you read his book, I mean, he's a philosopher, right? So if you read his books, you could get into the books that just like, what is he saying? But then he has these deeply practical books too, and his ability to write in an accessible way for I think most people was just really beautiful. And I don't think all like theologian scholars are always able to do that at the same level.
Wonderful. Fascinating. Well, thank you so much. Again, we're here with Krista Autrey, who currently serves as the director of the Center for Calling and Career at Geneva College in Pennsylvania. Krista, this has been an absolute delight. Thank you so much for joining Anchor today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.